Now let's simply see an example, which should make this clearer. For that, attached you find a simple project which has 3 folders, or 2 folders and 1 file. An assets folder, an info folder, and an index.html file. The extra folders and files you see here are just here in my local setup for version control and for my editor settings. And we can ignore them right now. You don't need them. They're not related to the web page. So we got 3 things in there, 2 folders and the index.html file. Now you can simply double click that index.html file and it will open up here in a new browser window, or it should at least. If not, open a browser window and drag the index.html file into it. Now this is a little dummy page I prepared for you. It holds some dummy information about this course and about me, your instructor. All this information is valid, by the way, but of course we're not building this web page here. Right now this is mostly HTML and CSS, or to be precise, it's pretty much all HTML and CSS at this point. And you can always go back to these files, and in the assets folder you'll find an images folder with my image, you'll find a styles folder with the CSS files, and if you would look into the index.html file, for example by right-clicking on it and opening it with a text editor, and you can use either text edit here on Mac or the normal Notepad or text editor on Windows. If you are using text edit on Mac, go to preferences here, and on open and save, make sure you check this display HTML files as HTML code instead of formatted text box. Then close this and reopen with text edit, and this only applies to Mac here, and you will see the raw HTML code. So this is a bunch of HTML code here, but what you won't see in there is anything JavaScripty in this file. It's just HTML and some imported CSS styles. This leads to this page, and here on this page we have these 2 links, dynamic interpreted and weakly typed. And if you click on any of these links, you're taken to a new page. Here's the dynamic page, where we see a more detailed explanation. And here's the weakly typed page. Now what we have here is a traditional web page, and what we also have here is a new request being sent to a server if this were served by a server instead of our local file system, and a new page being loaded, right? We're always loading a new page here. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but a more modern way, a more user-friendly way of doing that might be to not load a new page here, but instead to show this piece of information maybe in an overlay to the existing page, such a modal, as it's called, a little pop-up-like window which gets loaded as an overlay on this already existing page, so that we don't need to fetch a new HTML page and break the user experience a bit therefore, but instead that we stay on this existing page and only tweak it a little bit. So we kind of need to tweak the existing HTML code, this code here, which was loaded by the browser, whilst we are on the page. So without loading a new HTML file. That's the idea, and that is where JavaScript can help us and why JavaScript was invented and why it is so important these days. Because any modern website you visit, all these exciting user interactions you have there with drop-downs, with overlays, and so on, all of that is driven by JavaScript. And we can turn this page here into a more exciting page as well. I prepared something for you. You might have noticed that in this starting code I provided to you, in the assets folder, you also have a scripts folder with an app.js file. .js stands for JavaScript, and this is how you store JavaScript code in JavaScript. Now we can of course also inspect that file by clicking on Open With, and then also text edit. And what you see in there is JavaScript code. Now at this point of time, of course, you won't understand all this code. Maybe you understand none of that if you have no previous experience with JavaScript, and will of course change that throughout the course. We'll start at the core basics, and you will understand all this code once we progress throughout the course, and of course once we completed the course. But for now we can just take this code for granted, close this file, and ignore it. And instead let's go back to our index.html file, to the source code we opened here in the editor. And below this link here, where we import the app CSS file, above the head here, let's add a new HTML tag. Script, also a closing tag for it. And then add a src attribute to script here. and point at assets/scripts/app.js. So at this JavaScript file we just had a look at. That alone won't do the trick. Let's also scroll down a bit and go to these two links we have here, to the dynamic interpreted and the weakly typed link. Now there, let's remove that link to info dynamic HTML and add a hash instead, and instead add a new attribute here, data-text, to this anchor tag here, equals, and then double quotes. And now let's go to the info folder and then to the dynamic HTML file, open that with the text editor, and simply grab the text you have in there between the paragraph tags, excluding the paragraph tags, and copy that and paste that here between the double quotes. Now make sure you get rid of any line breaks you might have in there, because that will not work, so that this is all one long line of code in the end. And thereafter add one more thing to the anchor tag, class, to add a CSS class, info-modal. Now repeat that. We can copy all of these attributes on the second link and replace its reference with the hashtag reference as well. And the text we show there should of course now be the text we find in the weakly typed HTML file. So if we open that with the text editor, let's grab this text here we find in there, copy it, and also replace the text here on the second anchor tag with this text. Now again, make sure you get rid of any line breaks you might have here, because these will break your code. Now with that, let's go back up to our script import and add one important word here after the src attribute, and that's the defer attribute. This controls how and when this JavaScript code is executed, and I'll dive back into this a little bit later. For now, let's just add it, then save this whole index.html file, go back to your page and reload it by simply clicking the reload icon here, and then click on one of these links. And now you will get this nice overlay here, which you can also close by clicking on that backdrop. Now what we have here is new content, which is dynamically added to this existing web page by JavaScript. We're not loading a new web page here. Instead, this overlay is shown by JavaScript. And this, of course, is a way better user experience, because now we don't send the user off to a new page. We don't wait for new HTML code to be downloaded. We change the existing page. And this is something you see on a lot of modern web pages because it's faster. It's more like in a mobile app where you also don't have to wait for things to complete. And therefore, this is one of the core reasons why JavaScript is that important. It allows us to make web pages more dynamic. So if we come back to that question of what JavaScript is, if I quickly dive into the core things we learned on this previous slide, JavaScript is a dynamic, weakly typed programming language. It's an interpreted language, which means it's compiled on the fly. It's compiled before it runs and not compiled during development as some other programming languages are. It's a hosted language that runs in different environments, though thus far in the last example we just saw it run in the browser, but I'll come back to other environments in this course as well. And the most prominent use case is the case we just saw. We run code in a browser on a web page to make that more dynamic. So now we understand why we use JavaScript and what it allows us to do. But what do these terms, dynamic, weakly typed, and interpreted, as well as hosted language, mean in detail?